What's up, guys? To the Translesson Plan, your go-to podcast for transgender history. I am your host, Mari, and if you don't know who I am, go ahead and refer back to the first episode that I have posted on this podcast, where basically you'll be ended up meeting me. You'll get to know a little bit about my background, my credentials, and all the information basically that you need to know before listening to this first episode of the podcast. And of course, we definitely got to celebrate that we are now releasing the first episode of the Trans Plan. I am ecstatic to go ahead and talk about this first topic of the Trans Plan. And of course, guys, we have to start from the beginning. We have to start from the beginning. We have to start from the basics of all basics. Basically, you're just now coming into this world and you don't know anything. So we got to go ahead and go ahead and get into this first thing I want to talk about, which would be terminologies. We have to. You have to be able to crawl before we walk, people, and terminologies is going to be our first step to crawling. And with that being said, a lot of today you're going to learn about a lot of definitions of all of the genders that fall under the trans umbrella, trans being within the asterisk, and as well as their origin stories. Basically how they all kind of came about. And I like to go ahead and discuss this because I feel as though, we can't learn everything at once. So sometimes we have to be able to kind of combine everything into an episode, which is what this is going to be today. So to go ahead, I want to start off with talking about how there is historical proof that transgender or third gender people have been around for more than 2,500 years. And a lot of that first starts off with the Native American and indigenous cultures that introduce us to really mostly these third genders that we're going to be discussing, or gender variants, which would be another terminology that some people might be able to, learn from or have heard about. And that basically started off a whole, like kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, but basically it started off a whole new opening into this world. I guess that's the easiest way I could probably say it, because I know I'm thinking of a word, guys, but it's not coming there. So to go ahead and start when it comes to, going more into terminologies, I do want to discuss the transgender community first. And with the first one we're going to start off with, which will be transvestite, which originated back in 1910 from a very well-known German sexologist who was an extreme advocate for the transgender community, Megan Hirschfeld, which is a person who has the desire to dress in clothing affiliated with a social gender other than the one that they were assigned to at birth. Now, this could also be someone who wears clothing that does not engage in any sort of body modification. Of course, that can mean plastic surgery, facial modification, phalloplasty, etc. Next time we're going to go into is transsexual, which originated back in 1949 by Megan Hirschfeld again, which describes an individual who has sentiments, emotions, or visual sensitivities that are not normally associated to the gender binary associated at birth. And lastly, we're going to talk about, our well-known word that we all know about, which is transgender, which originated back in 1965 by a psychiatrist by the name of John F. Olivan of Columbia University, who invented the term transgender because he felt that the previously used term, transsexualism, wasn't adequate. And although this is kind of like a playoff to transgender, trans, which really is a British term, wasn't founded until 1996. Now, that's just the encompass of the transgender terminologies in the transgender community specifically. Now, of course, like I said, trans, being that it's an asterisk, it's an umbrella term, people. So we have to go into our family, friends, brothers, sisters, and they, thems, zems, theirs, etc. And that goes into, of course, the non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, etc. gender identities that we have out there. So to go ahead and get into that, I'm going to start off with non-binary, gender queer, and gender fluid, which is all the same correlation. They all correlate together, basically, guys. So non-binary, genderqueer, and gender fluid became popular among activist groups in the mid-1990s. As we know, Ricky Ann Wilchins is strongly associated to the terms and claims to be one of the first people to introduce it. And all these terms, of course, describes a person whose gender identity isn't associated with neither male nor female. And these are identities that exist beyond the gender binary. And with that, like I said, since all three of these kind of correlate together, they are all referred to as a non-binary gender identity. Now, like I said earlier in the podcast, I went to talk about how Native American and indigenous people are the first ones to, introduce us to basically gender variants. And they also introduced another terminology that some people might know about, which is Two-Spirit. And Two-Spirit was coined back in 1990 during the third annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian Conference in Winnipeg, Canada by Eldemira Learme. It is derived from the Ojibwe terms of Niz Matioag, which means two spirit. It was used to set Native American First Nations people apart from non natives, and some indigenous people use the term two spirit to express their sexual, gender, and or spiritual identity when they identify as having both a masculine and a feminine spirit. Now, lastly, one last terminology I want to get into deeply, of course, is going to be gender nonconforming, which originated in 1991 by Lisa M. Diamond, Susan B. Bonner, and Jana Dickinson, which describes a person who does not fit the gender norms or the roles that society, my apologies, expects, which a lot of us really don't fit into society norms if you're listening to this podcast. So, although I went through these specific terminologies within the community, there are also other lists of gender identities out there that people associate themselves with that fall under the trans umbrella as well. To go ahead and quickly get into those, agender, which means without a gender, was founded in the year 2000. Androgyny, which means neither male nor female, but both at the same time, became prominent in the 1970s. Bigender, which means those with any two genders, male, female, or other, was also founded in the 1970s. And lastly, pangender, which means those who identify as all genders, which right now is unknown of when the term was first invented. There is evidence that pangender dates back to the 1980s to 1990s. Now, like I said, I know I went into the definitions and the originations of when these terminologies came about, but I do kind of want to go ahead and get into the backstory of some of these origins of some of these, terminologies that I earlier discussed. So Hertzfeld's description of transvestism included what later became known as transsexualism or transsexuality in the 20th century. Dr. Harry Benjamin coined the term transsexual in the 1950s following the sensational publicity surrounding Christine Georgeson's surgical transition in 1952. Now, although we deem transsexual to be an outdated term, whereas transgender has become more or less equated with what transsexuality used to mean, ironically, guys, the term transgender was coined by people who wish to distinguish themselves from transsexuals, which, as I discussed earlier in this podcast, as you can kind of tell the difference between the two, transgender and transsexual now have two different definitions. So, back then, before the term transgender was created, everybody described themselves as transsexuals. So now moving forward, of course, with the terminologies becoming more and more prominent and new, it allows us to kind of distinguish between different terminologies that once kind of equated within each other. Now, though the phrase two spirit is now included within the LGBTQ plus umbrella, it does not merely refer to someone who is Native American and gay. Native American two spirit people were traditionally male, female, and occasionally intersex persons who mixed male and female activities with qualities specific to their identity as two spirit people. They were neither males or women in most tribes, so they equipped it a different alternative gender status, basically. And the gender variant members of most indigenous societies have unique terminology in their own languages for the social and spiritual functions that these individuals serve. Now, with over 500 remaining Native American civilizations, attitudes towards sex and gender can be highly diverse. Now, the non binary gender has been addressed in ancient Hindu literature as far back as 400 BC to 200 AD, when Hijras, persons in India who identify as anything other than male or female, were mentioned. And gender nonconforming is purposely widespread that encompasses terminology that transsexual, butch, femme, queen, tomboy, femboy, etc., have come about, which all encompasses is that terminology specifically. Now, I do like to say and point out, of course, as you guys heard, there are lots of gender identities out there, but I do want to point out that gender norms differ by country and culture, and as well as by historical era within cultures as well. So, oftentimes, those who identify within the trans being in the asterisks, umbrella often shows self-reporting gender atypical behavior in childhood. And now this is according to studies, guys. So, I'm pretty sure most of us who listen to this podcast that identify within any of the gender identities that I have mentioned have been able to kind of, see that their gender identity that they were assigned at birth can differ, and they do point out, atypical behaviors from that. And I can definitely, vouch for that because I can definitely say I've done more masculine presenting things growing up as a kid, and I have Um, so it kind of led me down the path of, of course, being a trans man to today. So to find up, guys, when we think about trans issues, it raises deeper questions about, what it means to not only be living, but lead us into a territory that we rarely actively examine. So for this, setting forth some more technical meanings of terms that we use in everyday speech, and as well as defining other words that we don't need to use at all, can be beneficial before diving into the historical event, which is one of the reasons why I say we have to crawl before we walk. So spending more time talking about terminology and concepts can help reveal some of the hidden assumptions that we make about sex and gender, and as well as introduce some of the issues, that we will obviously there discuss in upcoming episodes. So to wrap this up, please, guys, remember that new phrases and concepts emerge all the time. And that terms discussed in the podcast when it originally airs, which is today, may change tomorrow. So, one thing I always like to say is Google is your best friend. So, thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode of the Transcendent Plan. I am your host, Mario, and of course, we are here every Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, where I will be dropping new episodes. And until then, guys, go ahead, be safe, mask up, and until next time, peace.